So we've squirted out some fresh paint and we're ready to get started. Now that I've got my gouache here that's dried, I want to just show you if I go on top of this with a lighter value. You can see that it builds on top, which is something we wouldn't be able to do with watercolor. So I'm going to use wet paint out of the tube, but I can also use my reactivated dry paint. So I briefly showed you how to do this with the wash and watercolor and everything. So just like watercolor, we're just going to add a little bit more to create a wash. This is something I almost always do for my skies. And the reason for that is gouache will dry really opaque and darker than you think. So to get a really nice blue sky, I usually start with more water, similar to a watercolor, and do thin, and then I can build up thick as I move forward. So the reason I have cobalt blue on my palette, if you've watched my plein air course, you'll notice that I use ultramarine blue and lemon yellow a lot of time for my skies. And I found that with gouache and this palette, I couldn't quite get the effects that I wanted to have that really blue sky. And no matter what I was doing, I couldn't quite achieve the same look that you can get with a cobalt. So I just added a cobalt blue to my palette primarily for this reason of getting sky and having a more versatile selection with my blues. So we're going to work thin to thick here. So I've got my sky, and then I'll go over, let's say I have a tree or something to go on top of this. So I'm getting my paint pretty thick here. And then I can just build on top. And then let's say I go in and do the trunk of my tree. The other fun thing about working with the watercolor paper is you can get more of a scumbling effect if you have a cold press watercolor paper where you have more of this texture. If you have hot press, then you're not going to have as much texture with your watercolor paper. While we let this paint dry here for just a minute, I want to show you water and knowing how much water is in your brush. So if I've put water into this pile to create more of a wash, and then I have a lot of water in my brush, and I try and do some thin lines, it's going to be harder for me to get thin lines versus if I dry my brush off and then go in for just a little bit of this watery wash, then I can get some much finer details because I'm not picking up as much water. Now that this is almost dry here, let's show you. So I'm going to grab some brighter color here, throw some more yellow in. And then you can see I can go over the top of this dark and build up with some thicker paint. Now, the hardest thing about gouache is the value transitions that happen when the gouache dries. So your darks are going to flatten down to be lighter in value, and your lights are going to darken in value. So it's really going to shrink down your value range to be within the midtones. So that's something to really be conscious of, which is why starting with a wash can be so helpful, because it helps you to have a very light value. You can always build on top of this, but the more white you add, then you're going to get some chalkier color. So maybe this isn't as dark as I wanted it. So I can always add to create it darker, but it's harder to take away. So if I've made a nice blue and I put it down, and it's really opaque, and I think, oh crap, that's really dark, then I can reactivate it with my water and I can try pulling it up, but it's going to leave a lot more texture, and it's not going to be as nice and flat and look as much like a sky where it's just a flat section of color. So you can always use more water, create more of a wash, and then build up on top of that, but you can't really subtract as well in a similar way to watercolor. So make sure we're working from thin to thick in that way. So here we've got our values. So I'm just going to mix a really dark value here. So you can see how dark this looks on the palette. I'm going to paint it in here really thick. So as this dries, it's going to become more similar to this value right here, where it's going to really lighten up. It is darker than this, but it's going to lighten up as we watch it dry to become a lot flatter. And then let's do something light in value. See, we have a nice greeny, bright spring color. And we're going to watch as this is going to also dry a lot darker. So we have a value range. Dark and light. And it goes, 1 through 10. So as we do these darks here and they dry lighter, it's going to push us into these mid values. And as we have our lights and they dry darker, it's going to push us into this mid zone. So we have to keep that in mind constantly while we're working with our gouache so that we don't get too pushed down into this mid-tone. So that's why when we're working with our lights, it's good to do some washes starting with your lights and then build those darker. And then with our darks, wait until later on and then to make them darker than you would think, because they will lighten up. So holding off on our darks until the end, and then starting with our lights, and we can build up using washes to increase the transparency and the lightness. If we're trying to achieve white, then we're probably going to want to leave that section of the paper completely white. It is possible to go on top with white, but it's also going to dry and it's never going to be quite as white as the white of the paper, unless we really, really lay it on there. So if possible, we want to leave an area of our paper white and then paint around that area. And then if there's something somewhere where we accidentally pull in, then we can go for our white after it's dry, and then we can paint over that with a white to try and work out that area, and that'll create a softer edge as well, which is something we'll be talking about soon, is creating edges. So now that this is drier, we can go on top with pure white if we make those mistakes. But you're never going to be able to get quite as white as the white of the paper unless you're really building up that gouache. So it's always best to leave your paper white where you want it to be really white. So if we're working with snow or aspens or something like that, then we need to keep that in mind. So you can see now where these two are starting to dry out, how much darker this has gotten. And then here, how this is getting lighter, and you can see the puddling areas right here where it's still dark. And see how this value is starting to lighten as it's drying. So here's an exercise that I want you all to try. I've created some colors over here that just were some leftovers from a painting I did. And I want to show you, I'm going to come in and I'm going to try color matching and value matching. So that's pretty similar in value. This is a little warmer, but that's about right there. And then if I come down to this one, add a little bit more. So what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to match this to this. And then as it dries, I'm going to pay attention to the values so that I know, okay, when I painted this, it was very similar to what's next to it. And as it dries, I can compare, okay, let's see how much darker that's going to get than what I thought it was going to be. And you can see as it's already starting to dry, it's starting to get darker. And then let's do this dark one at the top. So you can see that there's a slight, when I started, these two were about the same value, but you can see as it's gotten darker, this one had more water in it, so it's actually dried quite similar to that one. But there's just this slight value change that we need to keep in mind. This one's not quite dry all the way, so as it dries, it's going to get darker. And you can see over here, see how we've still got a little bit of water. It's starting to dry, but if I reactivate this, you can see how much darker that looks than how light this is. And if I reactivate this one with some more water, you can see how much lighter that is, and it's going to get down to this dark right here. So keeping that in mind, after you try and mix the same exact value as this, I want you to come in and I want you to try and create this exact value in compensation for what it will dry to be. So now I'm thinking, I know that if I mix this exact same value, it's going to dry a little bit darker. And I've got a lot of green going in here, so let's pull in some more blue. So how much lighter do I need to make it for it to be able to dry down to be that exact same value? And there's different ways to lighten. You can lighten using more water, and you can lighten using some white. And I'm not quite grabbing as much paint. There we go. Add a little more water. So go through this, just take whatever colors you have on your palette and you can mix around and play with them. And then you can go through and try and match those and try and match the values. Make sure after you do these that you spray your palette down and wipe everything up so that you don't just end up going back and grabbing the exact same value, because you really want to train your brain to learn, okay, I need to paint this much lighter to be able to achieve this goal.